A conferência de hoje é aberta à nossa comunidade, se chama Women and the Modern Domestic Environment. Muito obrigada, Mary. Thank you, Mary, for being here. The mic is yours.
Obrigada. Thank you, Adriana. Today, I'm going to, I basically am addressing a question that the early historians, basically, that I talked about yesterday, Hildebrandt and Platz, gave an answer. And I'm going to give you a kind of expansion of their answer from the perspective of today, at least my perspective. I have in the subtitle, Furniture, Kitchens, Housing. I will deal with furniture more explicitly in my first lecture in Recife. So today I'll focus, I told you there was too many kitchens. I'll focus today on kitchens and housing and give you a little more background on that image I kept showing yesterday in the first day of Graduação. Okay. Again, feel free to interrupt, and afterwards, as I said, only one talk today, and then the second part after a break, we can have a discussion, or if any of the students volunteer to lead the discussion or make any presentations, we'll follow with that. Okay, I'm starting off with this essay that I think I just put recommended, not required, by Linda Nochlin, which was groundbreaking and is responsible for my talk, in a way, my talk. In 1971, more than 50 years ago, Linda Nochlin wrote a brilliant and groundbreaking essay titled, just as you see here, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Her answer, as I'm sure many of you know, or at least assumed, was not that women lacked talent or perseverance, or any innate capacities that might allow for the creation of great art, but rather that it was social, economic, and institutional factors that made it impossible. Motherhood, housework, social obligations, the lack of training and mobility, all prevented women from having the experience, time, concentration required for serious artistic production. And until recently, we could have readily asked the same question about women architects and would have gotten an almost identical response. Today, however, I would like, as my title proposes, to ask a more positive question. How did women change or help change modern architecture, which, as I said, those two early historians already in some ways answered. And more specifically, how did women change European modern architecture and design before World War II? However, in posing this question, I need to state at the onset two qualifications. First, that I won't fully answer my own question, but simply propose several areas where I think women's influence is most visible. Secondly, as you will probably have already noticed from my first two talks, I will frequently blur distinctions between design and architecture. And in fact, this was common still in the 1920s and 30s, as it was throughout the 19th century. For example, modern architects such as Alvar Aalto and Mark Stam designed furniture. Likewise, individuals who began as furniture designers, such as Gerrit Rietveld, Pierre Chareau, or Marcel Breuer, designed buildings. And that was even in the case of Le Corbusier, who, when he had his early training, it was in the decorative arts. And even though he later couldn't seem to design modern furniture, in the teens, he did. In the case of women, this blurring of boundaries between the two fields is even more evident. Like many of the most renowned European women designers, architects of the period, Eileen Gray, Charlotte Perriand, Lily Reich, studied the decorative or fine arts before attempting architecture. Not surprisingly, given that many schools in Europe did not accept women until after World War I. For example, the first French woman did not graduate in architecture from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris until 1923. And it was not until the late 1930s, in fact, that the first women received architectural degrees in Spain and Italy. And I gather in Portugal, it was not until the 40s, even later. So I gather in Brazil it was earlier. So that in itself is interesting, but we can talk about that later. For years, the coupling of women designers with modern architecture was regarded more often than not as a contradiction in terms. The revered heroes of the European modern movement were all men. Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. So too were most of the seemingly secondary players, including their kind of male image of the modern movement, but I thought I had images of these secondary figures, J.P. Aud, André Lersa, Giuseppe Tirani, those people that we sort of discovered post-Gideon, they were all male. The very image of the self-assured genius breaking with conventions and academic styles when it was invariably male. Much contemporary theory, even that written from a feminist perspective, has reinforced this ingrained perception of modernism as male. Autonomous, pure, austere, the privileged realm of male activities, that is design. In contrast, as I mentioned yesterday, mass culture was almost always seen as female, commercial, impure, and inferior. In other words, high art is male, entertainment female. However persuasive this argument might be for literature and other cultural forms, and I have my doubts really about that too, it is only partially true for architecture. If the machine imagery of Le Corbusier's Vers une Architecture of 1923 still perpetuated the masculine biases of modernism, other dimensions of modern architecture, its emphasis on domesticity, its social agenda, and the formal challenges to traditional gender conventions, its emphasis on domesticity, suggests a more complex story. One that I hope to show gives a more substantial role to women as a source of both inspiration and as creator. As feminist scholarship since the 1970s has shown, women were actively engaged in European architecture between the wars, despite considerable social and institutional obstacles. And here are, portraits of some of the women I've already mentioned, like Eileen Gray, Lily Reich, and Ino Alto. All that were, as I've said earlier, excluded from many of the early modern the modern architectural histories post-1940s, such as Siegfried Gideon's and Rainer Benham's. But I would also like to cite in passing other important women designers whose names were largely unfamiliar and deserved to be better known, some of whom I've mentioned before, such as Marlene Polzig. Here's some images. Elsa Gadoni, who worked in Israel and the US, Helena Sirkis, whom I mentioned earlier, in Poland, Lada Cohen, again in Israel, Ingrid Wahlberg in Sweden, and Leonie Gossendorf, who really had a very large practice there, especially in the 50s. And there are so many more I might mention, and we also have referred to the Brazilian women who are active. In contrast to some of our assumptions, women's role in modern architecture, as we've already seen, was widely acknowledged. And I'm going to just skip through these slides since I gave much of this yesterday, and I forgot to admit them. And I'll start today with my focus on kitchens and housing. But basically, I want to propose that the focus on domesticity and housing in modern architecture offered women new opportunities for participation in the profession, and that they in turn helped shape these concerns. Certainly more than their male peers, women designers were acutely aware of the need for reform. As late as 1939, British activist Marjorie Spring Rice, she's someone we need to know more about, lamented, quote, excuse me, domestic slavery of mind and body of the millions with whom rests the immediate care of a home and family. And this phrase, domestic slavery, was common in this era. Women were seen as tied, forced into these roles, taking care of their families. Women, I suggest, brought a new array of interests and skills to this arena, whether from personal experience or their previous training in the decorative arts, or even their active engagement in this domestic reform movement. And they tackled all scales of domestic design, including household objects and furnishings, more about that in my later lecture, kitchens and room arrangements, and urban apartment blocks. In trying to outline this contribution of women to modern architecture, as I said, I'm going to be focusing on 3 scales, saving furniture for later, of domestic architecture: furniture, kitchens, and housing. And in each case, I shall focus primarily on the work of one designer. Although the sources of women's innovation vary considerably, I would like to emphasize 3 factors in women's experience that seem especially relevant to their contributions. First, their decorative arts training for furniture and interior design. So here, the fact that their education isn't conventional in architecture, I think is highly important. The second is that domestic reform movement that I keep mentioning, and you'll see more about that, including household rationalization. But a third factor that I haven't mentioned so far, women's long-standing engagement with social and charity work, which was especially important for their role in housing. Now to kitchens, domestic reform, and household rationalization. And there is probably no arena in which women had as much influence in modern architecture as the kitchen. And Monica's comments yesterday really underscored that for Le Corbusier. For centuries, architects ignored the kitchen as a subject of design. It was considered a utilitarian space, one primarily for servants and housewives. By the late 1920s and 30s, and this is apparent in Gropius's house for himself, the master's house, and his wife, Isa, this changed dramatically. Architecture exhibitions also featured model kitchens. Professional magazines published articles on kitchen design, and architects included photographs of kitchens in their own work. You see here Alvar and Ino Alto's kitchen, primarily designed, of course, by Ino. Not their own kitchen, but that for Villa Maria, one of their most important commissions of the late 1930s, as an example. And I've already mentioned this, but the importance of the American domestic reform movement and its impact on Europe was all important. It was led, I would like to stress, by middle-class women. Their interest had been sparked by various factors, including the pre-war women's movement, the so-called servant crisis, which everybody talked about after World War I, and the growing promotion of rationalization in industry, which hit Europe a bit later than the US, but was certainly present in Germany by World War I, came to France, first in the automobile industry, but more in the 1920s. Following the example of Americans such as Catherine Beecher, you're going to get tired of this image, but even more important, here her drawings, but more important, as I've said earlier, Christine Friedrich, and another important women household reformer, Lillian Galbraith, in the early 20th century. And these reformers all just wrote books, campaigned, gave lectures, all arguing for the rationalization of housework, to apply the principles used in industry to streamline production to the running of the home, following the ideas first of the American industrial engineer Frederick Winslow Homer. And these women reformers argued that housework actually should gain professional stature and respectability. So instead of seeing it as slavery, it should be taken as a profession in its own terms. The European domestic reform movement had its earliest and strongest role or impetus in Germany. In 1921, someone named Irina Witte translated Frederick's book, New Housekeeping Efficiency Studies in Home Management, 1913, not a very romantic title, really emphasizing this professional scientific dimension, into German. And this may have inspired Benetta Ote's kitchen for the Bauhaus House on Horn that I showed later. Yesterday, in fact, as well as Bruno Taut's book that I also showed yesterday, where, called The New Home, subtitle Women as Creator. And in 1929, there's no doubt that, 1926, when Erna Meyer published her book, The New Household, which went into, you can't believe this, 29 editions in 2 years. It was a bestseller. Clearly this was a topic that touched a lot of women, maybe even a few men, on how life had to change. Her book was soon translated, and the Dutch edition was very popular, and was followed by numerous studies of household management in the Netherlands, France, Finland, England, and Italy, including, here's some more images from Erna Meyer showing her practical solutions for household reform. And here's the example in Italy by Lydia Morelli, I mentioned her, whose book also had a tremendous influence there, publishing, once again, Christina Friedrich's diagram. Frederick had insisted that kitchens should be used strictly for preparing of food or clearing away, and proposed the grouping of related activities and continuous work surfaces at correct height and proper lighting and ventilation as necessary reforms for the kitchen. Many of the young European women designers, including Ino Elto, Lily Reich, here's her drawing of an image I showed you earlier, the photograph, and a Finnish woman that we need to learn more about, were all influenced by Frederick's ideas and the reform movement in general. The Finnish woman was Salimi Setala, and they all embraced these ideas and proposed model kitchens. If anyone knows more about Salmi Setala, I'm probably mispronouncing her name, please let me know. I've been trying desperately to find images of her, more examples of her writing. I keep hearing her name mentioned, but I know very little about her. In fact, I would just mention, it's very hard to find images or portraits of some of these early women designers. The most famous of the model kitchens was already the one, here's Lily Wright, the photo I showed you earlier. The most famous designer of the prefabricated question was, without doubt, Gret Lohotsky. Oops, did I turn it off by accident or anything? Is it still all working? Oh, okay, I have to talk closer to the mic, sorry. Was Gertrude Lohotsky. First Lohotsky, when she designed, she got married in the process of working in Frankfurt. He was working under the auspices of Frankfurt's municipal building department, headed by Ernst May. The Frankfurt kitchen was one of the first fitted, was the word they used, European kitchens. It came complete with stove, sink, built-in cabinets. What distinguished it most from other kitchen designs was its wide-scale production. Approximately 10,000 units were installed in 4 years in the newly built settlements in Frankfurt alone. It was serially produced. I hesitate to use the word mass production because it was produced not like Henry Ford's cars in runs of 100 or 300 or even 1,000. It was produced in sort of units of 10. But the fact that there were 10,000 units produced was absolutely outstanding by European standards of the time. And it really became a model for European modern architects, both men and women, in the interwar period. Lohotsky's interest in kitchen design dates back to the early 20s, before the Frankfurt kitchen, when she began working with Adolf Loos in the Viennese housing office. She herself was Austrian, one of the very first women to graduate from architecture school in Austria. Here, she studied kitchens as part of her research on low-cost housing and proposed, I find this kind of amusing, a concrete kitchen made of concrete, which was to be factory assembled and mounted by crane. There you can see the concrete counter in this image of this early Austrian kitchen. Ernst May was impressed with her work in Vienna, and when he visited Vienna, shortly after he was appointed city architect of Frankfurt in 1925, he invited Gertrude Lohotsky to join his team of architects. And there's a sort of interesting, fun anecdote, which could well be true. When he wanted to convince Gret Lohotsky to join his team in Frankfurt to change countries, he asked the young but experienced designer how much money she would like to earn. And then she gave a figure, and he promptly doubled the amount she specified, hoping to convince her to come. She did. In Frankfurt, as in Vienna, she was deeply committed to providing functional, comfortable, affordable housing to thousands of workers. But her ambition, like May's, was broader, to create what they called a new Wohnkultur, a new living culture, with health, sports, and other leisure activities available to all. Architecture, including her functional kitchen, was a means towards a fuller and more egalitarian life. And the descriptions of this life are very much part of the magazine and publicity they offered, this magazine Das Neue Frankfurt, that was actually quite widely disseminated in Europe, especially in Italy, as we've discovered. And it really promoted a kind of whole vision of modern living, that the kitchen is really only one part, but an important part, especially for women. Her primary goal in designing the kitchen was to reduce women's labor and ensure physical comfort. Besides warding off stress-inducing drudgery, Lohotsky considered the kitchen a step towards women's self-development, which, contrary to the pervasive rhetoric at the time, she placed before, quote, the family as a whole. But she made no mention of women's special nurturing and aesthetic roles along the lines of Swedish reformer Ellen Key, or even, quote, the new pleasures or the joyful creativity that Erna Meyer believed would ensure the rationalization of the household. In other words, she's not really doing it to promote motherhood or happier families, but actually to promote woman's own self-fulfillment. Undoubtedly, Lohotsky viewed cooking and cleaning as necessary chores, and she admitted that she rarely cooked in later interviews. Ones that in her time were without question the burden of the housewife. And I think we always have to think about this double problem, if you will, that at one moment the interest in the kitchens reinforced women's traditional role in the household, but on the other, at that moment in time, there was just no question of men doing part of the cooking or cleaning up, unless they were really, really exceptional. And I can't tell you, I haven't run into too many of those in the interwar period. To assume otherwise in 1926 would have been utopian. In 1921, in Mai's magazine, this is an earlier magazine of Mai, she had declared, quote, first, life is work, and second, it is relaxing, company, pleasures. The kitchen was for work, the more spacious living room for pleasure. Segregating the two would eliminate disturbing noises and smells in spaces used for relaxation. Before designing the kitchen, Lohotsky did numerous studies of cooking movements and circulation patterns in order to determine the most efficient arrangement for equipment and utensils. And some of these are her early study sketches of the kitchen. By the way, there's a wonderful exhibition on right now in New York from the Viennese archives of her drawings. Here I'm showing you rough sketches, but she had a wonderful hand and also did some very beautiful sort of poetic drawings. As models for the design, but notice too the careful numbers and figuring out on the sketches. These aren't just rough design ideas, these are actual careful studies. As models, she looked at professional cooking spaces intended for men, such as ship galleys and railroad kitchens, compact spaces where one or two people could cook for hundreds. In addition, she studied closely Witta's translation of Frederick's New Housekeeping, which she later described as her Bible. And I talked to Laura Kramer, who knew her, and said that Lohotsky had actually said that she had Witta's translation on her drawing board as something she constantly consulted as she was designing the kitchen. However, unlike Frederick, Lohotsky also sought to extend rationalization to construction, and I think that's an important difference. She conceived the kitchen as one unit that would be serially produced to reduce costs, as I said, and thus made affordable to as many as possible. And to attain this goal, she worked closely with the industrial manufacturer, George Grumbach, and several women's groups, constantly wanting to have feedback from women about what was important to them. An entire unit cost approximately $50. I don't know what that means in current terms, whereas the individual components, if purchased separately, would have cost about $90. So it was almost half the cost as if they had been bought individually. There's some debate about this cost factor. I think she really meant it for working class and lower middle class women. But there have been stories that just to use these new appliances, including electricity, was too expensive for some of the working class women. Luhotsky proposed not just that famous Frankfurt kitchen, which you see in the skinny model there. She proposed 3 models of kitchens. I show you the bigger one there. 2 larger ones intended to accommodate 1 or 2 servants, and 1 smaller unit. Type 1, the renowned Frankfurt kitchen, which was the cheapest and by far the most popular of the 3. Depending on the housing complex and the orientation of the apartment, minor variations of the layouts were possible. And this flexibility was actually made possible by those small production runs I just mentioned, 13, 15 units at a time. And each one of these units was worked out in precise detail. She kept the type 1 galley kitchen intentionally very compact. It was about 9 meters by 3.44 meters, so that several tasks could be completed while sitting on a pivoting stool at the end, simply by extending one hand. Thus, all the equipment for cooking preparation and cleaning up, the cutting board, cold storage box, it's before modern refrigerators, you still used ice cubes, double sink, drainage board, and cooking utensils were grouped together at one end of the kitchen near the exterior window. And you see the pivoting stool there. Her idea was that women could sit on that stool and do all those activities without having to get up. Although the technology was kept modest to minimize costs, Luhotsky introduced a series of very practical devices, including a removable waste drawer below the cutting board for any vegetable scraps, so you could just brush off your scraps into this drawer, a wooden plate rack attached to the underside of a cabinet for dishes to drip dry. There were no, washing dishwashers and dryers at that with drying units at that moment, and a special set of aluminum canister drawers that have pouring spouts and measuring bars for easy usage. And you see them on your right in the lower cabinet. Do any of you have any ideas what were problematic about those drawers? The idea was you could just pull out a drawer with flour in it, and because it was designed to pour, you could just pour it into a measuring cup and eliminate a bowl or whatever. What might be a difficulty? She later had to move these drawers. Any ideas?
Bugs.
What?
Bugs.
No, they were pretty seal-proof. She was worried about bugs. I'll mention this later. She, in fact, looked at studies on what color paint was best for deferring bugs. And they decided it was a blue-gray in Germany, something North African vernacular architecture had already kind of discovered. If you go to, I went to the Emzab in Algeria, and lots of the fronts of entries to houses and stuff are painted blue, supposedly to deter bugs. No, I don't think it was primarily bugs. Any other ideas?
Industrial products, the things work like more in powders that they came in cans. I don't know.
Well, she managed somehow to get these industrially produced out of aluminum. No, the problem was little kids. And maybe it took she didn't have any children yet at that point, but they thought they were the greatest toys for playing, and they'd pull them out and spill the flour. And there was one, and so she had to later move the drawers up higher in her later runs of the kitchens. There was one other problem. Any other ideas? She made them all the same size. You have any other thoughts on this?
Pets.
What?
Pets.
What?
Pets.
Pets. Well, pets, I don't think could really get into the drawers. But, you know, who knows if you had a really good pet, as a cat, perhaps they could do something. No, it was that she didn't accommodate the fact that different amounts of food require different sizes. So the women all complained that there weren't enough, the drawer size was much too small for potatoes or cabbages, but you know, it was fine for flowers or split peas. So there was a kind of idea of standardization that didn't quite work with reality. And I think we have to realize that many of these early experiments were just that. They hadn't worked out all the, excuse my double entendre, bugs in the design of the drawer system. But nonetheless, it was a great idea and very kind of appealing aesthetically. Oh, well, back to the image for a moment. Two other notable features were an insulated cooking box, which the household wife could use for slow cooking. This is long before those crock pots, or I don't know what the name of the modern device is for slow cooking. She decided that you could use the heat from the stove to keep warm for those women who were working. They could prepare the meal before they go to work and put it in this insulated heat box so that it didn't require as much reheating when they returned home to prepare dinner or while they did other household chores. There was also a hanging lamp that could be moved along a metal rack, which you don't probably know, but maybe have some idea how expensive electricity was at this moment in post-World War I Weimar Germany. And so to have two lamps would have been virtually impossible. So you could move the lamp to save for lighting. There was also, one of my favorite features was the folding, let's see if we could go back, ironing board. I don't know if you can really see it. On the left at the back by the window, you could sit still on that pivoting stool, push the ironing board down, and use the electricity provided in the kitchen, or else just heat the iron on the stove, which was probably more common in those days, to iron the clothes. There are those famous aluminum drawers that the children like to play with. Lohotsky's aesthetic choices, glass cabinet panes, aluminum sinks and drawers, tiled floors and splashboard, sometimes linoleum floor rather than tiled floor, sorry, and counter space all reinforce this image of an efficient, hygienic workspace. In the iconic photo of the kitchen, the floor and linoleum countertop are black. The Roberts fabric walls, she used a kind of waterproof, you could clean wallpaper, and stove hood were white. The most popular color for the wooden frames of the cabinet doors was this grayish blue I just mentioned, especially chosen to repel flies. However, the enameled wooden cabinetry and framing, this overall image seemed modest, almost primitive, compared to the kitchens designed a few years later, one of which I'll show you in my next lecture. By the way, many of these kitchens are still in use and seem to still work very well, with now substituting modern appliances and sometimes painted different colors. However, I wonder how long that's going to last, because now that her name is well known, museums have suddenly decided they need to purchase Frankfurt kitchens. So one by one, residents are selling them off to various museums, which happened in the Museum of Modern Art, just when I was writing an article for the MoMA book, Modern Women. Public reaction to the Frankfurt kitchen was varied. Most modern architects and critics praised it, as did many housewives, for its efficiency. Here's an image, by the way, of one of them I saw recently in Frankfurt today. Still with the low drawers. And the efficiency side was part of the publicity that and his whole team, it was really a collective effort. I can't stress that enough. They did this movie showing women at work, just like modern industrial studies, to show how efficient the kitchen was. There was also a film. A government report on kitchen design cited the Frankfurt kitchen as the best solution up to that time for those without servants. It was also widely celebrated in the press and popular culture. There was even a song written in Lohotzky's honor. If you can read German, there's the song. And cartoons were done of her. I mean, she was a kind of, rock star in Germany in the late 20s, this amazing woman who made life so much simpler. However, the kitchen reformer, Erna Meyer, whom I've talked about, criticized it for being too rigid and too narrow, at least the Model 1, for 2 people. Meyer's own roomier kitchen designs at Weissenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart in 1927, one of which she designed with Hilda Zimmermann, the other in a collaboration with J.P. Aud, can be viewed as direct responses to Lohotzky's model. But I might mention they too were concerned with a window over the counter where you worked. Any ideas why you wanted a window over the counter to work besides light? Yes, watch the kids. So the idea was women, of course, multitasking. Someone said it was much more than a double shift. It's like a 5-person in 5 shifts. These women, children were out to play, but you could watch them while you cooked. Other complaints, there was still a debate too, I don't want to get into this too much, about the living kitchen versus the work kitchen. The living kitchen, the Wohnküche, was the country model where you ate in the kitchen and the whole family gathered. It was decided in Frankfurt that that was a problem because of ventilation, smells, etc. And Shute Lohotzky went along with that program. Later, she said, with ventilation and modern fumes, etc., the Wohnküche made sense. But I think you should know that it wasn't clear at that time that there was a huge debate at the moment. But no matter how one, and then later in the 80s, a new generation of feminists in Germany would criticize the Frankfurt kitchen for segregating women and not sufficiently accommodating the creative dimensions of housework. Lohotzky herself rejected that assessment. By the way, she lived to something like 103 and was still dancing at her 100th birthday party. She was a kind of amazing woman. I could get into her biography, but also someone who was jailed for protest for her efforts to basically get rid of Hitler in Austria during World War II. But back to the kitchen. She argued in a later assessment when feminists were saying she downplayed the creativity of cooking and housework, that the elimination of labor, regardless of who was cooking, was beneficial. In fact, it could make cooking more creative. She also raised the issue whether the dissolution of sex-specific practices of role behavior, and I think this is an important quote of hers, can be expected to result in any way from such an architectural spatial transformation. So I think this is a question for us. Can we really expect architecture to change social mores or not? To what extent do they help or not? It's something we can really debate, think about, even argue about. How determinist is architecture or not? But no matter how one views the kitchen, as inadvertently regressive in reinforcing women's traditional role as housewife, or as progressive in allowing women more time for other activities, including employment, Lohotsky and Meyer's designs represented a break with gender stereotypes and traditional images of domesticity. And I've kind of alluded to this before. Like the domestic reform movement in general, they helped undermine long-standing assumptions that rationality, efficiency, and modernization were male values. And inversely, the decoration, emotion, and coziness were essential qualities in women's spaces. I also think in terms of architecture, Lohotsky and reformers like Meyer and Witte can be seen as extending the domain of architecture itself to include domestic service spaces that, as I said, had been ignored by male architects in the past. The influence of their efforts was felt almost immediately throughout Europe. In France, for example, Paulette Bernège, a recent philosophy graduate, actively took up the campaign for domestic reform with 2 publications in 1928, Household Management and If Women Made Houses, the latter illustrated with delightful sketches. I'll go back to this later, but I think it's worth showing. Can anyone read the French in the captions? No? Otherwise, I can say, give you a summary. They're very funny. The one with the Eiffel Tower says, if you climb a stair 5 times a day for 40 years, it's the equivalent of raising 9 million kilos of the Tour Eiffel to the height of 2.5 meters. Have no idea where she got this statistic, but she's really arguing about the inefficient design of most houses. When women, sometimes in traditional French houses, the kitchen would be on another floor, even from the dining room, and the idea was the servants brought the food up and down. No more servants, the housewife's bringing the food up and down. Not that it was good for the servants either. And the other one, which is very funny, is she says, this is typical, very awkward design of Haussmannian apartment blocks. She said the distance between the kitchen, again intended for the servant in old designs, was the distance after so long, so many years. How many years did she say? She doesn't say, after 40 years again. Walking between Paris and Lake Baikal in Manchuria. So back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room was this endless, fatiguing journey. So basically, she brings humor to these studies of rationalization. Kitchen design was a major concern for her, and she again had the challenge of these weird Haussmannian blocks hitting boulevards. How do you make a rational triangular kitchen? And she published her studies in architectural magazines like Technique et Architecture or the magazine L'Architecture before Technique et Architecture. I could go into this more, but she was also a friend of Le Corbusier's, invited him to congresses. He invited her to the CM 1929 in Frankfurt on the Minimal House, where he himself did not attend. And I'll go back to this when I talk about Perriand next week. I'm going to skip this for now. By the early 1930s, male architects as diverse as Walter Gropius, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, Hugo Haring, and Rob Millay-Stevens were all designing kitchens. In other words, these early women kitchen designers made men change their own roles. And there was probably no image that was published quite so much as this one image of Millay-Stevens for a very lavish villa. I don't know if you know Villa Carrois by Millay-Stevens. It was for a rich family, but he put a lot of attention and energy into the kitchen design, and it was publicized all over the place in France. And basically, we no longer had it dismissed as a subject of design. And although there were limits to how much rationalization could improve the daily lot of women, and certainly it did not resolve the gender division of labor in women's double or multiple shift, the very recognition that household drudgery was oppressive to women, including servants and housewives, that domestic space required modernization, undoubtedly encouraged, I would like to propose, a social climate that would lead to later reform. So what I'm trying to suggest is that these images that clearly weren't widespread, they didn't touch all households, but they set a standard, a kind of model that would really take hold post-World War II. But the imagery, the ideas were already there in the interwar period. Okay. How are we doing? Okay. So the second issue I want to talk about today is housing and the role of women as housing reformers and their goal in housing reform, not just to rationalize the household, but to allow women what I'm calling as public citizens. That there was a role not just to reform their drudgery, but to give them other options. Women's interest in the transformation of the domestic realm extended beyond furniture in the kitchen, arenas that might be seen as almost natural extensions of women's traditional role, to housing at a larger scale. Charlotte Perriand designed the residential units for Le Corbusier's Villefrancheuse in Algiers plan. Lohotsky worked in both Vienna and Frankfurt on the design of numerous housing settlements, and I showed you earlier yesterday this image, this plan she worked out for studio apartments for single women. Helena Sirkis, whom I also mentioned, with her husband, Seisman, was responsible for several of the most important housing complexes in Poland before World War II, including this really important early modernist complex for the Warsaw Housing Cooperative in the mid-30s. Other women, lesser known, and whom I hope will be the subject of future studies, were actively engaged in housing, often designing projects with innovative programs and collective amenities. I showed you a project, but in black and white, that Hildebrandt had celebrated the remarkable housing complex in Vienna of 1925-26. Think how early that is. The same year as the Great Paris World's Fair, where all Corbu had built in terms of housing at that point was really the Esprit Nouveau Pavilion, no large housing complexes. Ella Briggs had designed this major housing complex in Vienna. A home for unwed mothers in Helsinki by Finnish architect Elna Kiljaner, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, 1936, 10 years later, who, by the way, also designed kitchens inspired by Sjoerd Lohotsky's models. And again, if any of you know anything about her, I'm going to sort of bug any of my Finnish friends if they'll start doing research on her, because I can find out just about nothing. However, not everyone concerned with housing and urban development, and this is really important, was trained as a designer or architect. This was true of two of the leading housing reformers of the period in the US and England, Catherine Bauer in the United States and Elizabeth Denby in England. As in the case of the women's movement for household rationalization, the Women's Campaign for Housing Reform after World War I had its roots in efforts dating back to the 19th century, especially in Britain and the United States. Maybe there are examples in Brazil too, I would like to know. Here I show you image of the remarkable Octavia Hill, who wrote a series of books calling for the transformation of slum conditions and was herself involved in the design of this arts and crafts project for impoverished residents in London, the Red Cross cottages. In the US, a really talented polyglot woman, Edith Ulmer Wood, played a similar role in the first third of the 20th century, writing books about housing, campaigning for housing, writing housing requirements for government agencies. Lots more research needs to be done on her, although there's a little bit. And the other major figure that I mentioned was the younger Catherine Bauer, a fervent modernist who was commonly known, the phrase was a houser. She advised labor unions to build their own housing with better units and more amenities than were standard in low-cost housing at the time, including, for instance, in this very important housing project she advised on, the Karl Mackley Housing Project, for the hosiery union, the American Federation of Workers. It was a hosiery plant workers, many of which were women, that it should have amenities like daycare center, laundry, community center, and even swimming pools. And it was interesting for me to see Patagonia yesterday that they included a gymnasium, a swimming pool, but there were model examples of this already in the mid-30s in the US, but of course in ideal projects as well. The actual project was designed by Oskar Stoninoff, who had emigrated, but was also the editor of the first volume of Le Corbusier's Œuvre Complète, and a little footnote, was the partner of Louis Kahn up till the post-World War II period. Since Bauer's career has received considerable scholarly attention, at least in the US, I'm going to focus today instead on Elizabeth Denby's remarkable efforts to improve housing. A writer, a political advocate, and designer, she called herself a housing consultant. Denby had an important role in alerting modern British architects to the social dimensions of housing between the war. And architect Maxwell Fry, whom you may know better as the partner of Jane Drew in Tropical Housing, called her, quote, the finest domestic architect I ever met. He gave her strong praise for all her efforts in the 1930s. Like many women who became active in housing issues in England since the late 19th century, Denby's involvement with design grew out of her experience helping to ameliorate the lives of the poor. She had a degree, she was very educated, in social science from the London School of Economics, and for 10 years she worked as an administrator of voluntary organizations, primarily the Kensington Council of Social Services, where she also directed its housing trust. However, she was frustrated with the paternalism and lack of professionalism of so many charity efforts. And in 1933, she decided to embark on a new career as an independent housing consultant, in which kitchens, by the way, were a major subject of concern for her. She even had a BBC, a British broadcasting program, on the radio talking about kitchen reform and calling for a revolution in kitchen design, which needed the advice of experts and housewives to be well designed, and that architects needed to improve their job. Anyway, that same year, 1933, she met Maxwell Fry, who was one of the leading modernists in Britain, and who had recently become a passionate proponent of modern architecture. And they began to collaborate on two seminal housing projects for low-income residents, Sassoon House and Kensal House. There's an image of Elizabeth Denby, and I just show an image of a very important book she wrote, where Gropius, after he emigrated to England, wrote the preface, Europe Rehoused, where just like Catherine Bauer, she actually went on a study trip all around Europe to look at the very best examples of housing, things like Neue Frankfurt, the New Frankfurt, but also social housing in Sweden, Finland, etc. Austria, of course, the subject of Red Vienna, the interesting housing projects that you already saw Ella Briggs and others do. Although Sassoon House, there's her kitchen studies, looking rather primitive compared to what was happening in Frankfurt, but compared to what was done in England at the time, she introduced, for instance, gas heating, so you didn't to boil water, so you didn't have to use coal stoves, etc. And there's Sassoon House. Although Sassoon House was the first modernist working class housing project in England and widely praised for its spacious, well-planned units, Kensal House, her second project with Fry, gave the two of them an opportunity to realize their social vision more fully. Denby seems to have been largely responsible for the programming and overall concept, Fry for the building structure and architectural form. It's still, by the way, lived in remarkably good shape, and I felt totally safe visiting it on my own. So if you get to London, it's worth a trip to see it. Sponsored by the Gas, Light and Coke Company, KLCC, Kensal House was intended to demonstrate the benefits of a superior low-cost source of fuel, namely gas. However, Denby and Fry soon persuaded the company's directors to create a new kind of housing that would allow people whose incomes allowed them little more than sheer necessity, as they put it, to experience, and I'm quoting, life as full as it can be. In particular, they wanted to create, just as the American housing reformers had, a more vibrant social community, what Denby herself called, quote, an urban village. And they tackled these goals in two ways: through the creation of efficient, comfortable units intended to minimize the burdens of housework, in other words, applying scientific management to the household, but then, just as important, the inclusion of collective amenities, which they hoped would foster social connections and a sense of public participation. Working closely with Fry, Denby brought to the design of the housing units an attention to functional details, especially concerning women's needs, that was rare even in the most advanced modernist housing complexes. Among the most innovative features in each apartment were the gas-lit coke stove and the built-in radio speaker in the living room. You can see it there in the image. Modern gas appliances in the kitchen, including an instantaneous hot water heater, Ascot brand, and a washing copper. I had no idea what a copper was. This is a difference between US and England. It's apparently a large pot where sheets or diapers were boiled. You can't imagine the labor of laundry in this era. And a recessed balcony for drying laundry. At that moment, even advanced modernists like Mies van der Rohe thought women had to carry the laundry to the roof or else downstairs to hang on lines to dry. But she had a special balcony so you could dry the laundry there, eliminating this burden of carrying heavy wet laundry. Off the living room was a second balcony, large enough to fit a table and for children to play in. And to ensure that residents had a degree of privacy, the walls and floors of Kensal House were well insulated, and the parents' bedroom was entered off the living room, leaving them a private suite after the children had gone to bed. Ground-level storage for baby carriages and bicycles at the base of stairwells spared mothers the labor of lugging prams up the flight of stairs, as was typical in tenement housing. And I still think that would be a great idea, to have a place to store strollers and bicycles right at the foot of your units, instead of having to bring them up to your hallway, which we do still in New York. In addition, Denby furnished a model apartment, choosing inexpensive, well-built pieces that residents could then purchase if they wished at a home furnishing a non-profit shop that she helped run. So it was really a whole project, again, a whole way of living, how to have low-cost furnishings, how to have reduced labor, etc. But above all, she sought to create more than comfortable, affordable residence she wanted to reduce the drudgery in women's lives so that, quote, she could free the individual to take part in the other sides of life, the life of the mind and spirit, I'm quoting her, and in particular that the application of scientific techniques to the private realm would allow women more opportunities, quote, for participation in the public realm. Thus, providing collective facilities was of special importance to her. And the project included a rich array of them. She was an amazing politician. She talked these gas company officials into agreeing to everything. A nursery school with a play terrace and wading pool was designed in this curved form, which she thought this was essential. Early childhood education, she thought, would cut the slum tradition at the root. It was open from 9 to 5 so women could have time not only for household work or working, but to participate in the Kensal Club and other public activities. Denby had been highly critical of the physical and social isolation of most low-cost housing projects and believed that fostering of community in such housing would lead to a greater sense of community at large. And by all accounts, Kensal House was a successful endeavor. Just show you some more images. Here are images of the nursery school from the period, and the children enjoying the large walkway around the complex, taking naps in the nursery school. And the other part that was really important to her were the formation of these clubs, where she had one for teenagers, workshop. They were still gender divided. Men would do woodwork, women could do sewing, knitting, have gatherings for tea, etc. By the time Kensal House was inaugurated in 1937, Denby's ideas about habitation had evolved further. She remained firmly committed to the idea of urban life, but was skeptical of high-rise apartment blocks, even those with the amenities of Kensal House, as a solution for low-income housing. Most working-class people, she maintained, still dreamed of a cottage with a garden, though not at the cost of social isolation. And she actually gave the first speech to the Royal Institute of British Architects, a very controversial speech, basically decrying high-rise housing and proposing early on low-rise, high-density housing and mixed urban development. Apartments for single people and childless couples, low-cost, high-density housing for families that would be near schools, community centers, and other collective amenities. And she presents these ideas at an exhibition in 1939 that the Daily Mail, a British newspaper, proposed, called the All Europe House. And the title came from her studies of European housing, that she kind of put the ideas together. She designed this herself, even though she wasn't trained as an architect, synthesizing her knowledge of British working class life, all the lessons she had learned from all her earlier charity work, as well as her trip. Again, to keep costs and labor to a minimum, she wanted to do this so she could improve women's lives. And the exhibition catalog proclaimed it, a house that is a woman's house book come true. And like the Kensal House, it was widely praised by the press. It was inspired by Georgian examples. She proposed a complex of stepped, what we used to call echelon terrace houses. The two-story, flat-roofed, bricked houses had minimal front yards with only a paved terrace and flower boxes, resulting, as one critic noted, in a pleasantly urban and humane street. The backyards, in contrast, were generous, including a private triangular terrace shielded from the neighbor's view, and a garden large enough for flowers and a few vegetables, which opened onto an extensively planted communal garden. So there was the private space and then a collective space. She placed the kitchen at the front of the house so mothers could keep an eye on the street, and the living room at the back so it could overlook the garden. And then she had a committee of women design the various rooms. I won't go into that, but one of them was a specialist, Dorothy Braddell, in kitchen design, the only trained designer. The others were by amateur women, but were very interested in interiors. Denby's efforts suggest a realism about costs and an understanding of popular taste, I think, that was rare in the modern movement, and not certainly common in most of the designs of the heroic figures. She was not alone in preferring low-rise to high-rise housing in the 30s, but what was unusual was her sensitivity to working-class values and her insistence that modern housing maintained the diversity of urban life. Her interest in consumerism, which she shared with other women modernists, anticipated both the concerns of the post-war generation for affordable good design and the appreciation of architects such as the Smithsons and Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown for the everyday and the ordinary. They were words that came up yesterday, and I can't stress enough, this is the side women keep bringing into the modern movement in this period. Similarly, her commitment to low-rise, high-density housing foreshadowed critiques of the 60s of modern urban renewal. Like Jane Jacobs after her, she realized how essential social and functional diversity was to women's engagement in the world. and to the vitality of cities as a whole. And I feel like you're really lucky in parts of Rio to have just that kind of diversity, in contrast to many modernist cities that segregate commercial from residential. The contributions of Lochotski and Denby differ markedly in their formal character and social intentions, but each in their own way, I think, helped recast architecture from a profession that was primarily devoted to monumental, institutional architecture to one that was deeply engaged with domestic reform, housing, and social issues. They were not, of course, the only women to do so. Similar claims might be made about Aino Elto, who I keep mentioning, here's Marta Blomstedt, who did work in Finland, a very understudied woman architect again. I gotta get these Finnish historians to work. Gina Ulbrich, I don't know if you know her, a really important urban architect in Tel Aviv, an emigre. But other women were likewise involved in housing, like Elsa Godoni, whose name I've mentioned before, Vlada Cohen, and of course Lily Bright. All these women had active careers before the war, and there's the Platz quote I had mentioned yesterday. This does not mean that modern architecture was free of the sexism and stereotypes so pervasive during that period. Architects were notorious for their sexist comments, and hierarchies persisted in artistic collaborations and office structures. The formal inventions, or what might be called the high culture of modern architecture, still remained primarily the province of men. But I think there's no question that these very interesting, strong women influenced our understanding of what modern architecture is, and our vision, perhaps more important, of what modern art life should be. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fine. But we should take a break, though, don't you think? Do people, for what I said just now, we can have a few quick questions. I'm sure many of you are eager for a break, too. But maybe questions on the actual talk, and then we can have broader discussion afterwards. Yeah, after the break. Any questions, either on the Zoom or in the audience? I'm curious, did any of you know Elizabeth Denby's work before? Another one of those women left out of the canon. I'm curious here, do you learn about Catherine Bauer either? She's more known in the States, maybe.
Margaret.
Yeah, Margaret.
Do you want to come here to talk on the mic?
Morning, Mary.
Margaret.
Thank you again for your lecture. Each day is better. Thank you so much. First, now I would like to, maybe it will be a provocative question, but I studied a lot Le Corbusier, a lot. And what you can talk to us about his book that we don't read, l'art décoratif d'aujourd'hui, hein? En français, l'impact de l'expo des arts décoratifs, parce qu'on la regarde, on l'étudie toujours comme une question de style, et du style art déco. Donc, et je pense qu'il y a eu un impact entre 1924 et 1925-26, il y a, comme vous avez encore nous montré, un tournant très très fort, Domestic Revolution. Hein. Et moi, je pense à PROURB, et je pense donc au rôle de sa femme, Yvonne, et de sa vie domestique, pas avec aux enfants, mais désormais avec une femme, first of all. Et second, la maison qu'il a fait pour ses parents, la petite maison surtout, parce que c'est le premier, pour les Brésiliens, le premier bâtiment qui Monteiro de Carvalho, c'est la personne qui a invité les Corbusier au Brésil à visiter, c'était la petite maison. Hein. Et troisièmement, qu'est-ce que tu peux nous dire donc sur ces projets de Le Corbusier dans les années 20 et surtout Pessac aussi? Comment on peut penser ces projets et sa évolution, disons, comme architecte? Parce qu'ici aussi, on continue à penser que Le Corbusier, c'est seulement la machine à habiter. Et je pense que c'est un tout petit peu complexe. Et tout le temps, je pense qu'il faut penser à ces hommes aussi, Ernest May, Wood, Gropius, qui tu as montré, mais aussi je voudrais vous demander sur Corbu, parce qu'il continue aussi à être très fort parmi nos enseignements.
You're going to hear more about Le Corbusier than you probably want to hear next week. But I'm not going to answer totally Margaret's question, but she's so right that there's this very big evolution in his work. You will see the beginning of that concern. I showed you the Manifesto for a Dwelling. That's already 1923. But he doesn't think about kitchens. He also thinks women are still too decorative, too involved with the decorative arts, embroidering kitchen, cushions, etc. But I hope in the lecture that I talk about on Charlotte Perriand next Wednesday to answer some of these questions. What I won't be able to answer, which I think is very important that Margaret brought up, is the role of Yvonne, the woman he lived with. They finally got married in 1930. She worked as a model. We know almost nothing about her. She was from Madagascar. She was very striking, of what they call a femme moderne, with cropped hair, quite chic, excellent cook. She drank a lot, but she was a very strong influence on him, undoubtedly making him earthier, more aware of domestic pleasures, all sorts of things. We have no archives on her. All we've got are the personal letters between, some of them, between Le Corbusier and Yvonne. So I'm not going to be able to answer that part. I hope someone else will find things that I don't know. But I hope I can answer some of that. What I think is so interesting, and it really requires kind of micro-history, why this huge change at different moments in the 20s. Germany, it happens a little earlier. I would say already by 23 in the Bauhaus, with Irene Witte's translation of Christine Frederick. In France, it doesn't really happen till 27, 28, 29, with the campaign of Paulette Bernège, the role of Charlotte Perriand, and others. There were other women designers that are very important. Not only Eileen Gray, who was a rather private figure, but her work was well publicized, especially E1027. She always had a servant, but there was also a very interesting kitchen with labels on the drawers and things. So these ideas were really beginning to take hold. I don't know that answers it. Any?
We have a question on Zoom.
Sure.
Let me see. We have a question on Zoom. Sylvia, can you open your mic? Sylvia?
vocês estão me ouvindo?
Talk again, please.
Agora vocês me ouvem? Hello, my name is Silvia. I'm a PhD student at Federal University, Fluminense Federal University. I would like to thank you for the excellent classes so far. In my research, I'm applying a feminist perspective to the analysis of cultural heritage archives in Brazilian housing from the 19th century. And most of the manuals from the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th in Brazil deal more with educational, moral, and behavioral issues of women rather than recognizing them as domestic workers. And when we deal with kitchens, there's a characteristic of research. There's more directed towards a model that undergoes changes due to hygienic aspects, because our kitchens tended to be full of uses, and animals and such things. And Frederick's functional diagrams, and even those of Lillian Gilbert that deal with economics, they have a character of being of very prominent principles of productivity and efficiency. In the modern these kitchens that you research, what's the main goal observed? Tailorist efficiency or the socialization of technology, or do they go hand in hand? Thank you.
It's an interesting question, and I wanted to know a little more what you meant by, before I answer, sociology of technology. I'm a little confused. Do you mean the implementation of technological innovation?
Yes.
Okay. I think they go hand in hand, and in some studies it's more organization and planning. It might be the case even in Christine Frederick's diagrams. It's how do you organize most efficiently. But the use of modern appliances as they come into production is also very important. Like with Elizabeth Denby using gas appliances. We'll see later, Charlotte Perriand also wants modern appliances, as did Gertrude Lahodsky, but also recognizing cost limitations. So they really they want new inventions, but they also want more efficient room arrangement. So we sometimes in the US, I don't think the boundaries are as clear in French. We talk about Taylorism as organization of the plant, of the industrial plant, of the arrangement. And we talk about Fordism as efficient production and the stream mass production. One is to do with arrangement, one is how do you speed up and make more objects for less money. Obviously, production isn't so much the goal in kitchens. But it was to some extent for Gertrude Lahodsky because she wanted to make them cheaper. So in that sense, she was involved with both Taylorism and Fordism, if that's clear. The bigger goal, though, as I keep wanting to stress, was to make women's lives easier. And we can criticize them for dealing with the domestic sphere and a traditional woman's province. But as I said, I think if we're realistic about the role of women in Europe post-World War I, just to make their lives less drudgery, even for servants. I mean, why should servants have to be running around up and down stairs and going big distances? And that's why I think even upper class kitchens, like Malay Stevens' kitchen that I showed, got redesigned and rethought, both in terms of efficiency, like you said, but also in terms of technological innovation. I want to stress, though, like electric stoves, there were only something like 10 electric stoves in Paris in 1929, from what I could tell. They were almost, the modern stove was gas, as opposed to coal. Refrigerate, the modern refrigerator, as opposed to the icebox, really doesn't come to Europe until after World War II in most households. And what people don't even know is the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, opened in 1952 or 53, depending on what you call the opening date, had an icebox. There was a pass-through for ice to be delivered to the icebox. There was still not an electric refrigerator. So this how modern the appliances are, they weren't modern by US standards at all. I don't know what the technology was in Brazil, but in the US, there was what was commonplace in US homes, middle-class homes, by the 20s was not commonplace in most European middle-class homes till the 50s or 60s. Really more the 60s and 70s after the recovery from World War II.
Maybe people need a break.
Mais alguma última pergunta antes de fazermos intervalo, break? So we're going to do a short break, 15 minutes.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we can
Thank you.
Yes, yes. So I didn't bring an resume of the text because you've just presented it like much better than I could do it. So I just I chose one point of the text for us to reflect on, and it was in the text of Henderson, yes, and that is irony of the
Lehotsky. I'm always happy when somebody else has trouble pronouncing because I have trouble pronouncing.
So Lehotsky kitchen, because there was this context about those women's club that were like against the New Women movement and those the redomestication of women, and maybe she contributed to that while making this kitchen. So it didn't change, it didn't cut at root, as you said, the patriarchy problem, because it didn't dismiss women from their domestic labor, other than reinforce the sexual division of labor, and make sure that this second shift is still determined towards women. No? So it was reinforced by this scientific thinking that would be the best way of making food or organizing this space, no? So, and I wanted to bring some questions about this irony, and I would like to bring other examples, that some things that we still do here or in the world, that they're trying to be like progressive, and instead of they're just replicating some of this patriarchy structure. So although in Lehotsky kitchen, she was when she worked in Lowe's, and I would like to bring like the text of Colomina, that she criticized his interiors as a domestic voyeurism, and despite the kitchen being freeing a woman, the other inner spaces of the domestic house reinforced their role as domestic parts. And I brought three examples of things that are not really architectural, but maybe reinforces that this sexual division of labor that still remains today, that is and you mentioned it before, like maternity leave, that it's only for women, and some companies are still struggling to do it with for men, and because it gives, like, legally the only possibility to take care of the child is for women because of a legal adjustment. Of course, there's a biological need, of course, but so, and for a gay couple as well, that if they want to adopt, that we don't have this kind of paternity leave here or anything. So this reinforces it, and it replicates it to the household. And other things in more abstract way, and I thought as a marriage as patriarchal structure that only views the family as one kind of type of family that is monogamic and based on ownership and based on a contract, and so this, and like when we struggle, like for gay marriage, for example, we are trying to be included in an institution that is already structured by this patriarchy, and this was one of the ironies that the Henderson brought in her text, no? When Lihotzky herself said that this could be like reinforcing things, no? And the other thing is what I said yesterday, the bathroom sign, and I wanted, and as well as in the first, the 20th century, there's clubs of women that were against the free women movement, and they were trying to defend the redomestication. Today, and our former government, Bolsonaro, we had a minister called Damaris Alves, that she was the Minister of Family, Women and Human Rights, and she defended clearly, like putting apart from any feminist agenda, that she, like for example, boys wears blues and girls wears pink, and this is other thing that, and she is not, as Lihotzky said, and she doesn't want to be aligned with feminist agenda, and this is still working on. This is still happening in Brazil and other kinds of country by defending the value of family and this kind of family, this kind of structure, and this is not directly architectural or in kind of shape, but it is, I think, reinforcing these issues. So, and the other thing is that the capitalist thing of thinking the kitchen as a product and the private space becoming a product as so as well as, so that's another question that I wanted to say to you. I don't know if I made myself clear because I became a little bit nervous. Okay.
Should never be nervous, but I get nervous too. Anyway, these are very rich questions, and they actually bring up the point that Gret Lihotzky herself made. Should I sit here? No, don't. Oh no, the light is too strong.
No, you can sit.
Oh, okay. That how much can architecture do? I don't think architecture can change paternity leave, or although architects as individuals can fight for it. And certainly when we set up firms, we can try to institute in our own firms, or fight in our own firms, or fight in our universities. I will say I'm very lucky to be at a university that gives men paternity leave, gives gay men paternity leave, that gives gay men health insurance. If they've been with a long-term partner, you don't have to be married or not. But there's certainly a long heritage or residue of this institution that's very, it's heterosexist, it's patriarchal, etc., that we still carry a legacy. It's still very hard in the US to have children and not get married if you want to protect the rights across all states. It's possible, but it usually demands good lawyers. Whereas in the Netherlands or France, I almost think marriage seems unnecessary for many couples who have children. I don't know the situation in Brazil, so it really varies. Things like abortion rights have something to do with architecture, in that having birthing clinics, Lori Brown, an amazing feminist architect, activist, writer in the US, has been designing clinics that are like half camouflage so that people can go to them at least where it's legal without getting protests and facing personal risk. But for the most part, the legislation is passed or not passed probably doesn't have to do with architecture. So I think we have to be honest about the limits of our field, what we need to do as citizens versus what we need to do as architects. So that would be one point that I made. But I also think this issue is, the kitchen is such a funny, complicated thing, because I wonder at times if men decided it was okay to use the kitchen when they started becoming efficient, full of nice new appliances. And I always joke that it's men who like the trophy kitchens in the US, so they can do their show-off cooking on weekends when they have time. And often the women get stuck with the everyday cooking. I used to feel like I cooked twice. Once for my daughter when she came home and needed to eat by 7 o'clock, and once when my husband came home late from work. No architecture solves that. Social conventions do. But I did think nice kitchens made it more acceptable for men to work in the kitchen. So that's a joke, but it's also maybe a grain of truth. What else in those rich questions? This issue of reinforcing roles or not, yes, it reinforced the role of women in the domestic sphere, but it also, I can't help it, think it alleviated work, freeing women for other pursuits. And I don't think that was a totally lost cause. I also think just eliminating drudgery, whoever's doing it, is a good thing. You can say, as the feminists did, that Gretchen Lohatsky didn't talk about the joys of cooking. But I'm not sure, it's always wonderful to cook when you have time, when you're not tired, when you aren't working 8 hours a day. I used to come home from teaching studio, just wiped, and how many simple pasta meals where I could make the sauce while I cooked the pasta. It got pretty repetitive, but I think we all have gone through that. But again, thinking about how architecture intersects with social issues, I think is really critical, but how much it can do is also a limit. But we can focus on program, like Elizabeth Denby did. We can really insist on collective amenities, daycare. Whether we succeed or not is another question. Any other questions on the talk, too? That was very interesting. Or do you have more to respond?
I do.
Yeah.
I'm not open. Can I?
Okay.
on Zoom.
Okay. Thank you very much. I like very much. It's about.
Can you open your camera so that we can see you?
No. Yes, but I'm cooking right now. I'm listening to the class and cooking.
Okay, that sounds very appropriate.
Very nice. And the text, also the text. I have something, I wrote something, and I'm going to read about the text. Henderson.
Yes.
RFG was a regression in relation to human achievements, a conservative change. Also, it was a type of social control in favor of capitalist industry. But what about Henry Ford's speech about the worker having a family which would make him save so he could buy the products produced by his factories? Wouldn't this all be a mechanism to act on value systems shaping a habitus of classes below the elite as consumers? Wouldn't both be a way of intervening in the value system creating needs and desires? It's not about architecture, but the context of this, okay? But affects architecture, ways of being in society, values, desire, and so on.
Yeah, and you remind me that I didn't address the capitalism question, and so I'm very glad you brought that up, and I think your point is very legitimate, and it's what Szydlowski would say herself, that the social structures have to be addressed, but you're also right that architecture can touch on it in some ways, but we have to think of the context. You should probably know, and it probably is clear from the essay, not only on a personal note, Susan Henderson was my student, I was her doctoral advisor. It was a kind of accident because her original advisor, George Collins, got ill, and I took over. It was my first doctoral student. And Susan was very left-wing. She wrote for Radical History, and I think you can see her political interests come through in that essay. With Szydlowski, it's interesting because I think you're right. The point made earlier, the kitchen becomes a consumerist product. So in some ways it becomes part of capitalism, even if Neue Frankfurt might be seen as an experiment in municipal socialism. It was a very progressive government, and it's not an accident that Ernst May, just like Hannes Meyer with the Bauhaus, takes a brigade to the Soviet Union, and including Gret Lhotsky. She was left-wing, there's no question, and a very courageous woman who became increasingly left, and risked her life fighting Hitler and was imprisoned during World War II. But I think it's a double story about the kitchen in Frankfurt, because she wanted it genuinely to be, and I disagree a little with Susan, I think it was meant to really serve working class women originally, as well as middle class women. Most of the people living in Das Neue Frankfurt, in Neue Frankfurt, were not wealthy or even prosperous middle class. They were workers, maybe lower middle class as well. But the cost, even though she worked so hard to reduce costs, it wasn't even enough given the economy in Weimar in that period. When we think about the poverty, the inflation was so bad in Weimar, Germany, that everything ended up costing people so much. And as I said, electricity was very expensive. So sometimes people couldn't even use their electric lights or whatever because the electric bill was too much. So there were times when the goal and reality didn't mesh together. I'm sort of the belief that architecture can be on the side of a certain political position, but it can't really change the politics on its own, for sure. And I keep always I try to remind my students to get very idealistic. My project will do X, Y, and Z, that I'm not sure their designs can actually change necessarily the way people live. And people also can live in very traditional structures in very innovative ways. And the example that I was talking to Mara about the other day, not a residence, was the prison in Cuba. The Ile de Pinos, or the Isle of Pines prison. I don't know if any of you know it. It was a big, like, Jeremy Bentham panopticon, but when Raul Castro and Fidel took it over, they turned it almost into a socialist commune. So how these roles change, often the same architecture can serve different ends. Or I think of Fourier's phalansterie, an example of utopian socialism, was really based on Versailles and the most, autocratic royal power. So how a same formal model can have different purposes, I think we have to acknowledge. So I suspect buildings in capitalism could be used for other purposes, just like we've seen buildings from the Soviet Union's most idealistic phase be transformed into, I don't know what you'd call the Soviet Union, Russia today, but a kind of oligarchic capitalism, state capitalism, what do you call it? But again, the same building can have different functions sometimes. Thank you so much for this provocative question. I don't know if I answered it really.
Very much. I'm liking very much. Thank you.
We have someone on Zoom, Barbara. Barbara, she has prepared some points regarding the readings.
Yes. Eu não consigo compartilhar. Consegue liberar?
Não precisa compartilhar, Bárbara, pode só fazer.
Porque eu já tinha umas imagens aqui para mostrar, na verdade, de algumas coisinhas. Mas tudo bem, sem problema. Talking about the teaching, outside from the architecture dialogue, like in the medium cities of Brazil, in the
Can you turn up the sound a little?
Architecture schools. So basically, the engineers were mostly men. Will produce the kitchens, and if you saw the kitchens, the refrigerators are like out the kitchens, because the kitchen is the space for the maid. It's a woman, but it's not the lady of the house. And the kitchen will be simply, and I'm from Belém, so it's my reality. It was my reality when I was there. It's a space for a maid, it's a woman, but it's not part of the house. So the kitchen is just to serve the other space, the other room. And this is one point of questions, like how this dialogue between gender in the design of the kitchens can be like extrapolated for places without architecture, but just places which reproduce the sites. The other questions about the text is about the space to listen and design with people. The space that are supposedly appropriate for the people. So I work in the UN, and we are like all the time asking, which is the perfect time to listen and to put the woman inside the projects. We have like hospitals, we have schools, but we don't have like a human being. We have like the architects and the projects and the time, but where's the people, where's the women needs? How can you implement a good designer thinking about people. How we can not assume there's this space is a space who someone wants to, but how can we listen in the project, in the process of design? Oh, there are 2 questions. Sorry.
No, they're very They're very good questions, and I'll do my best to bring up some points related to them. First, I think you're so right that the servant issue has much to do with it, and I think it was actually why I brought it up, and the timing is very different in Brazil, where I think families kept servants for a much longer time than they did in Europe and certainly in the US. The whole issue of domestic reform had to do with basically changing the servant economy, that there was perceived to be a servant crisis, and that suddenly the woman of the household had to be involved in the kitchen. But, or there were no longer as many servants, so the woman was involved with the servant in the kitchen, which was the problem when the kitchen was too small, like the Frankfurt kitchen. So I think you're totally right. What's kind of depressing hearing about it is that the servant is viewed as other and the space as other, and that architects think they don't have to worry about servants. But strangely, I'll use the example that I know the best. Le Corbusier was very aware of this. Excuse me. He publishes in this book that Marguerite mentioned, L'Art Décoratif d'Aujourd'hui, cartoons of servants having status of the housewife, leaving the household. The whole servant crisis had a lot to do with his proposals for the Immeuble Villa and that little manifesto I showed you, the Manifesto for Living, that realizing that the woman of the household, unfortunately not enough the man of the household, had to take over what used to be the servant's job. So I think you're totally right that because it was for the servants, it was relegated to a sort of other space. And I think, I was shocked to see, like in the design of Brasilia, there were still little bitty servant bedrooms, am I right? This would have been unheard of in the US almost. I grew up in American suburbia, a middle-class family. We didn't even have a cleaning lady. We had nobody. My mother did everything. She didn't work the first few years when we were little, but then she went to work, so she got us to work too. That was her solution. So that's a good point. But the second point you make, I think, is also really interesting and relates to the women I spoke about. Both Lochocki and Denby especially. Lochocki did consult with women's groups. Whether she consulted enough, we could argue about, but she really did have a committee, ask opinions, and then responded when she found out that, like I said, the drawers were too low. She responded to the criticism. And this was true for her work all the way through her career. In the Soviet Union, she designed amazing children's components and furniture. Later, she did daycare centers and things, and she was very interested in hearing clients, not just the person paying, but the user. But we have very much more concrete evidence with Denby, because Denby, working originally in charity, but rejecting the paternalism of charity, had a committee. She set up in Kensal House a whole committee of residents that she was consulting with constantly and adapting things in response. So I think this idea, I call it like early participatory planning. Almost before we use the term, participatory planning, they were interested in this consultation process. Whether it's genuinely democratic or whether there's still a kind of paternalism involved, I think we can question. There's no question that both Luhutsky and even Denby thought they were experts, but they did try to hear other voices. But I'm even going to tell you about, the big names, and maybe it was something they learned later in life. I don't know if you ever read the little book that Philippe Boudon did on Pessac, a project Marguerite mentioned. Corbusier's answer when he was asked about, Le Corbusier, when he was asked about all the changes the residents did to the buildings, he said, the people are always right. Now, was he being cynical or was he being honest? Maybe a little bit of both, but he never said it should be changed back to the way it was. He accepted that the buildings could change. And probably in contrast to Mies van der Rohe, it was one reason he was so hesitant about designing furnishings or having a controlled interior. He wanted to give residents a role in their environment. But this varied architect to architect. Frank Lloyd Wright was a total control freak, Gesundkunstwerk. And he even complained about sitting in his own chairs and getting a sore rear end. They vary, these various male figures. But good questions, thank you. And I guess, should we turn to Giovanna?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for reading the readings carefully, too.
There's one more student who brought topics, but I think we should turn to Giovanna. We have only 20 minutes.
Yeah, but I also have someone prepared. Do they want one quick question? Or?
Camila, do you want to do one quick question before we turn to Giovanna?
Or she can also talk next Wednesday.
Yeah. Camila, do you hear us? So let's turn to Giovanna, and if Camila...
Maybe tell Camila that if she wants to bring it up. My talk Wednesday next week will be like the third component of today's talk, so any other questions you have, you can bring up then, because they will relate. It's just focusing on another person, but many of the issues are very similar.
Okay, so she can do the questions, Giovanna.
Let me just say one thing. I just am thrilled that a couple of students, doctoral students, but other students are welcome too, are doing research on topics related to women or gender. It doesn't have to be biography or putting someone in the canon. If any of you have presentations you want to make for next Friday, I'm not planning on giving a lecture. I just want it to be discussion, student or faculty presentations. I want it to be very much an open session. I think you've heard, by then you're going to have heard enough from me.
So Giovanna is going shortly to present her research. I'll let you explain. You can sit here.
So maybe introduce yourself or introduce Giovanna. I love the end of the introduction when she thanks all these women. Well, I'm excited to have it. I started breathing, sort of thumbing through it during the break.
Hello. Well, this is intimidating. My name is Giovanna. I'm currently a PhD student in Mackenzie University in São Paulo, but I'm from Paraná, and I came here in person at Professor Mary's lecture, and she's giving me space to introduce my research, and it's going to be a short introduction. I'm currently in my second year, so what I have most is questions and doubts, so it's not going to take that long. Since I'm from Paraná, most of my questions come from the place where I grew up, and I went to São Paulo to be advised from Professor Ruth, because she's on that line of research about modern life, modern housing, and of course the paper of women in all those questions in developing housing interiors. Currently, the name of my research is The Shapes of Modern Life, Curitiba's House Design and its Interiors. And for those who don't know, Curitiba is located in South Brazil. I have here a map. It's right here, the state of Paraná. We are currently right here, and the state of Paraná is here. And here is Curitiba in the state of Paraná. And the main question that I have is, what I did also in my master's is a change of the main research that we students that are in South Brazil, we always have research that always look into the modern houses and all the publications about Rio and São Paulo, and the researches and the projects that are built in the state of Paraná, South Brazil, or even the Northeast are overshadowed, and we have this eager to bring it to life and bring it to the light. And the dwellings in Curitiba, the state of Paraná, are one of those examples. And that's what I did in my master's, and now in my PhD program, it's another look, but it's kind of in the same line of perspective. So here, just not to take that long, my geographical cut is Curitiba, the state of Paraná in Brazil. My historiographical cut is the 1940s until the 60s. And the main question that I ask is, Curitiba being in a city out of the big cities like Rio and São Paulo, how it got like modernized, how the modern architecture got there, and how the population that it's more like the population wasn't open to the innovations, and how the architects that mainly got there from São Paulo were able to modernize the city and were able to produce such a wild example of like modern houses. And currently in my research, my document sources are lifestyle magazines, domestic manuals, fashion decorating manner magazines. That's when I got interested in Professor Mary's lecture, because in doing so and getting deep into researching the lifestyle magazines, we see a lot of crazy crazy articles about how women must behave and how they are like they are the trophy wives and how they appear as just to in the pictures. This magazine, A Divulgação, that went from 1853 to 1975, would disseminate to the population the modern living, and it would have like manner articles for the women. And the main question that popped up was, but would women just be housewives, or would they help their husbands to develop the floor plans as well? And that was one question that came up. And here are some of the articles: the woman at the home and society, and an example of functional architecture. So currently, the idea is to go from the 1940s to the beginning of the 1970s and see how one of the objects of the research, of course not all of it, to see how the impact of the women helped to shape the floor plans as well, not only as the housewives and housekeepers, but as the wives of the clients, because in many of the examples so far, the women didn't have a voice, and the project was only for the men of the house. So that's a question that's being brought up. And also how the modernization throughout the decades helped to change also the shape of the floor plans in the house as well, and women being on the brought to work and being outside the house, not only taking care of the children as well. So that's how the research is going so far, and that's about it.
Thank you, Giovanna. Mary, do you want to
I just have
say
a
something?
question. Maybe it's too soon, but I'm just curious if you have some speculations on how strong the women were in shaping these environments, and how it changed in the time period you're talking about. If you see changes from the 40s to the 60s.
Yes, I've already seen some changes, not only because of the women, but also because of the change of the decades, because there was a big leap, mainly in its interiors, because of the French interior. Then was then the living room gained space based on the English living rooms. Yeah. And then modernists starting getting some space, and mainly because there was a big change in Curitiba in the 60s. I think the biggest leap was from the 40s to the 60s, because some architects from São Paulo went to Curitiba, and they were full of ideas, and they gained space and heard their wives, because they were projecting their house for themselves and their families, and their wives were heard as well. So there were a lot of open plan spaces and open kitchens as well. So I think that's the main thing, and also with the modern interiors as well. So I think that was the biggest that I can see so far. But I can say the house for themselves, for the architecture themselves. For their clients, I don't know as much now.
In fact, that brings up a really good point to think about how the open plan changed, because despite, for instance, Le Corbusier's discussion of the open plan, most of the kitchens up until the kitchen I'll show you next Wednesday were separate closed rooms. And in general, except for low-cost housing, usually public housing, where the idea was the kitchen and dining were combined, kitchens were closed, for instance, in France, especially if they weren't rural kitchens. And this is very different than the US, where the idea of, first there were pass-through windows, where you would pass the food from the kitchen to the dining room. But by the 30s, in places like California, where there was a kind of progressive, more relaxed lifestyle, the idea of open kitchens became very fashionable. This did not hit Europe till really quite late, because you can see the most sophisticated, advanced, modernist houses, whether we're talking Adolf Loos, whether we're talking Mies van der Rohe, whatever, the kitchens are mostly closed. One of the most open floor plans, though, really in terms of living, is the Schroeder house, where the woman had, Mrs. Schroeder, Truth Schroeder, had a big impact. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because for all my discussion of kitchens, I don't know why, kind of lacuna in my presentation, I didn't discuss, maybe because it wasn't yet so strong in Europe in the in the 20s, but this issue of the open kitchen became important. So it wasn't just about efficiency, it was about a more relaxed lifestyle between relaxation and work, or entertaining. And I showed it briefly, but you probably didn't notice, a cartoon that Corbusier published from 1935, where there's an open kitchen from a woman's magazine, and he says in the caption, women have broken with restraining customs, and they brought in a new way of living. And I think this idea of getting rid of the hierarchies that an open kitchen suggests is a really significant change, even if the women are still doing the cooking.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. Thank you,
Let me just thank Giovanna. And thank you, Giovanna. I look forward to hearing more how the research goes. It's a great topic. And I just want to really stress this research. I think we need to do more with popular magazines, with the press, just generally see how space, architecture, gender intersect. It doesn't have to be women designers, even if that's been my focus in many of the talks thus far.
Thank you so much, Giovanna and Mary. We still have Nina, so you prefer, Mary, to switch to Friday?
It's more everybody's energy, or Nina can talk on. Is Nina's on?
I'm here.
Oh, you're here.
I can talk on Friday, whatever is best for you. Just a sec.
You will have more time on Friday,
Okay.
but it's also nice to hear you in person. I just don't know how much energy your colleagues have. What is your topic, Nina?
It's here from here.
Yeah.
My advisor is Maria Cristina Cabral.
Yeah.
And I'm studying Love Hotel in Leblon, and the memories of the pleasure detached from the city in the 20s and in the 30s. And so I prepared a presentation, but if you prefer, I can talk on Friday, whatever it's better.
It's more you will have more time on Friday, but it's also nice to do in person. So it's more how the audience feels. Okay. We may have a short class on Friday. We'll see.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mina.
First, I would like to thank you very much for the classes for the last few days. Well, good afternoon. Thank you a lot, Professor Mary. And my name is Nina Zones, and my advisor professor is Maria Cristina Cabral. I'm a student here for my master's, and I have to say that this research here is really new because I've recently changed the subject of my research. And well, it's a little bit raw, I'd say, but let's talk a little bit about it. So in English, a possible title, Leblon Love Hotel, Memories of Pleasure Detached from the City in the 20s and in the 30s. And well, here I'm proposing the unrevealed story about a building designed to be a prestigious hotel, but that was actually known for being used as one of the first love hotels in the city. Why is that? Was it because of its location? Did the distance encourage lovers who didn't want to be seen? How is it related to the way the city was being appropriated at the time? Not only by men, but how now also for women, by women. And here are some songs, part of songs. I'm gonna read the first one in English. So the kiss started in Realengo, which is a neighborhood here, got hotter in Flamengo, another neighborhood, and ended in Leblon. It's a carnival song from 1935. And about the neighborhood and the urban expansion, just try to pass through this session quickly so that we can spend more time in the section about related to women in the city. Just a little bit of context. Actually, it was commended for being a hotel, and hotels first were located in downtown area here in Rio, but mainly in the 20s there was a remarkable displacement heading to the seashore. So grand hotels were commissioned to be built for an universal exposition in 1922, serving in some cases as an urban expansion vector for areas that were still not well established. And it was the early ages of balneary culture here being created in Rio. And a little bit also the important role played by the tram as a public transportation in the city, in this case connecting downtown area to, at the time, distant neighborhoods by the sea, especially here talking about the Atlantic Ocean coast by neighborhoods like Copacabana, Ipanema, and Leblon afterwards. So here is a photograph of Leblon in 1919, Leblon Beach, really empty still. But in this year, 1919, Leblon was received its first subdivision, the neighborhood, and also public lighting, and it started to be more infrastructure, but still really an empty space. And well, here, where were the women? Thinking in a space, this so-called love motel, as a place used both by men and women, we raise here the question, where were the women in the city? How can we comprehend the transformation process in which women begin to move around in the streets, penetrating the public realm that was once forbidden for us? And so here there are, of course, lots of hypotheses. I'm bringing an author an historian called Rosa Araújo, and she says that he used social and economic development in the end of the 19th century marks a new lifestyle for women, new socialization forms that were getting diversified, and especially after important urban transformations here in Rio, like in the period of Pereira Passos, and well, different forms of new socialization, like walking on the streets, the tram here again as a public transportation, a new form of social interaction, and also a way of displacement in the city, and forms of leisure that was linked with modern times, like the World's fairs that happen in the city, theater as well as another form of leisure, cafes, stores that were beginning to be used by those women. And also other forms of activity and leisure, like the sea bath, started to be appreciated not only for its medical purposes like before, but also as a leisure activity. And with that also we can gradually see more of people's bodies too, turning into something visible in the city. And other activities like dances and the images of modern women, dancing in clubs, jazz or samba. And well, I'm going to try to be more quickly. Here are some of the readings that are helping me to understand a series of different issues. And those four on the top helping me to understand those boundaries that were being broken between the house and the street, the domestic realm and the public realm. And well, it's important here to stress also, like Giovanna brought us the development of communication media, especially the illustrated magazines, and how it was important for a transformation on the image culture. And there are a lot of studies about these women, how they were being illustrated in the 20s. They called Roaring 20s. But one caught my attention, not for chance, of course, this one called The Apple. A maçã. The apple actually referring to the apple in the Bible related to the history of sin. Here the woman is the main character, and this editor, who was an important writer at the time, who is Humberto de Campos, he used to write tales and stories about love affairs, whether it was between couples like boyfriend and girlfriend, or whether it was like a married man with a woman who was not his wife. And I'm finishing. So, A Distant Love Hotel. How could we search for this unrevealed story? If sex is still considered a taboo, how could we look for information about how and where people were getting together for that purpose in the city? And what I'm doing now is trying to search in those pages, firstly in this magazine. So for forbidden spaces, we are consulting like unauthorized research sources. Those tales and stories written by those prestigious writers that used to write in these magazines, to comprehend what was going through people's minds at the time, which places in the city could be being used for love encounters. It's finishing. Yeah. Well, it's not charging, but...
Give it a moment.
Okay. And here is just a passage from another magazine, and I'm gonna read it. Frivolous and inconsequential, Madame told the adventure to friends with in a superiority way. She remembered to call an old boyfriend. They had gone together, sun sea bathing together, and the unexpected love episode ended ... in Leblon Hotel. Well, it's just the first steps of this research. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. Does anyone wants to?
Yeah. Any questions for Nina? What a great topic. I thought of one thing, and I'm curious if any of you had thoughts. There's a phrase in the US, honeymoon hotel. It's not the same thing as a hotel for affairs, but this idea of this special place that's sort of removed from everyday life. And I can't help it. I refer to it in an essay I wrote that I think I gave you for the website, that I wrote on Everyday and Other Spaces, which was a kind of response to Foucault. And he talks about the honeymoon hotel as an other space, a heterotopia. And I don't know in your readings if you've read it, but it might be interesting to you just as a theoretical base to think about this notion of how it both is an extreme example of something or an other example challenging the status quo. For Foucault, these heterotopias are there either an intensification of a process going on, like control, or else represent a kind of counter process, like carnival, of freedom and letting go. And where this hotel stands in that spectrum might be fun for you and stimulating. I don't know how far you can, excuse me, take it, but it's one source I thought of right away. But I have a feeling others may have suggestions for you too. What a great topic, and a lot of fun too.
Thank you a lot, Professor.
Oh, I think we could close for today. Does anyone here wants to?
Otherwise, next week on Zoom.
Yeah, next week Mary will be in Recife on Wednesday and Friday, and we will be on Zoom. We will change places. Thank you so much, Mary. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you, Nina and Giovanna.
I was thinking fiction, another great source is fiction. And even if it's not named, if there are escape hotels in fiction,
Yeah, it can be.
yeah. And thank you all for your
Hi, Gila, are you hearing me?
patience these last 3 days.
Gila wants to talk something.
For your lectures, and I would like to invite everyone to next Wednesday, and we are going to send the link to the Google meeting. We are going to work a Google meeting, okay?
Gila is going to receive Mary in Recife. She's a professor in UFRJ, and she's going to share the Zoom link with everybody. We are going to send per email to everyone, scripted in the form, the Google Forms.
And Gila has been doing research on women in the Northeast, and I am very much looking forward to her presenting some of her work on the Friday session. But I also want to really open it up, as I said, to any of you. So contact Mara or Gila, or if you're in Porto Alegre, contact Sergio and Monica. And thank you all. It's just been such a pleasure hearing your questions, getting ideas. You've made me been thinking harder. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mary. It was wonderful to have you here in our school for those 3 days. And we are looking forward for the next classes next week.